my name is Susanne Evans and welcome to the ChangeStories podcast. This is a podcast for people who are interested in creating change, whether that is within organisations or for individuals. In each podcast episode, I will have a conversation with someone about their work to share their story. Each story and conversation will provide you with ideas and inspiration for your own organisation or for you personally. To find out more about each episode, including further reading, and to share your change stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk. Hello and welcome to the Change Stories podcast. Today I'm here with Maurice Wheeler. Hi Maurice.
Hi.
Maurice is the CEO at We Are Family in London, the world's biggest and most experienced full service agency group that specialises in children, teens and their families. He's been at the front line of developing audience-led strategies for over 25 years, working with brands in entertainment, sports, FMCG, leisure and travel industries. Maurice, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today. I'm very excited to be talking to you.
Absolute pleasure.
So we've known each other for a really long time.
We have.
And yet, I think this is probably the first conversation we've ever had with each other about each other's work in any detail.
Quite possibly, yes.
So this is exciting for me. I wanted to talk to you about story, because I know it's something that you're very passionate about. It's something that you use a lot in your work. So how do you make use of story? And let's look at the kind of marketing side first. How do you use it in that?
I mean, storytelling is essential in marketing. We as humans are inherently storytellers and story hearers. So if you can associate and you can say the things you want to say through the medium of story, it's just going to land so much more effectively than if you just try and persuade people with kind of random data points or kind of logic. You know, there's an age-old analogy in marketing that you actually make decisions emotionally and then justify logically. That's been proven many times, even through like MRI scans, that actually the decision is made almost before the prefrontal cortex tries to work out why you even made that decision. And ultimately that's from storytelling. We are beasts and that like storytelling as part of the way that we understand the world. And so the brands that I work with, and brand is a key word there. So much of what they're trying to do is craft a story around who they are, what they stand for, what the benefits are that they have. And again, I think most good, successful brands have realized that you can't just do it through, we're 12% better than everybody else. You need to tell something that's a much more emotionally driven, particularly in today's modern age, which is so driven by opinions and influence that comes from social media, and social media is all stories. So if you're a brand, you've got to basically kind of tie into that storytelling world, and ultimately tell your story in a way that is compelling and interesting and exciting and appealing to the audience. So from a marketing perspective, storytelling is absolutely crucial to be able to then convince people that what you have and what you do is exciting for them.
I read some really interesting research a couple of weeks ago. So there's the study that Jennifer Aker did, I think it was at Stanford, where the kind of memorability of information via story, then it was 7 times more memorable. So she gave a presentation to a load of students and it's the same information, one fact-based, one story-based, and they remembered about 7 times more. But then I read something else recently that actually there's now been a piece of research that says it's 22 times more memorable. So we should all be doing this, shouldn't we, in our communications?
There's many different kind of facets of marketing that I'm involved with. Obviously, the kind of the creation of the marketing, the creation of the strategy, all that. And ultimately, if my clients, the stakeholders, if they don't remember the story, they won't remember the strategy. It's the two are absolutely fundamentally intertwined with each other. And if you can't craft a compelling story, people just won't remember what it is that you're talking about, because that's how we remember things. We are still very much storytellers, and that's how we kind of process and understand the world, is through the medium of story. So absolutely essential.
And so what does that look like for you when you're working with a client or a particular brand and you're helping them to create this compelling story? what are the key elements that you would want to put in there?
A large part of our business is kind of the research and strategy side, and we'll kind of get onto that a little bit more later. But ultimately, it's about understanding the audience. You have to understand what the audience is all about. What are the stories that are going to be compelling to them? So we work a lot, for example, with young. So some of our clients are storytellers. So for example, like Nickelodeon. So, they will have, or Moonbug's another one, and they will have story properties, so kind of kids story brands, and we work a lot with publishers that ultimately are about stories. So we, as far as what it looks like, the first thing is really to understand the audience, understand what it is that they want to hear, understand what it is that they will gel with. What is it in their lives that they're looking for? What are the kind of the truths, if you like, that you want to try and tell them? And then you've got to craft that story, which is the kind of the way. So we will always start with audience first. Like, who are they? What are their key triggers in life, and really kind of work up from there, and ultimately kind of work out where that Venn diagram is of who are the audience and what do they want, and what is the brand and what can it offer, and kind of what's that bit where the two cross over, where you go, okay, that's brilliant because this is what they want and this is what we can offer, and then kind of crafting that narrative where those two things align is really the challenge of marketing ultimately.
And I'm really interested in your work in particular because of the audience that you work with. So it's that kind of family audience. Is it different? Would you, for how you would tell a story to young people or to children and their parents, or is it the same, do you think, across the piece?
At its core, it's probably the same. But I think, one of the things that we, one of the things you need to be, aware of when you're dealing with children is their concept of story. And a lot of that comes down to things like the context of the world in which they live. So for example, when you're crafting a compelling story or a narrative for a child, you need to think about what's relatable to them. So for example, you couldn't create a nice, compelling story for a child which is set in a steelworks factory, because it would just mean nothing to them, and it would be, and they just wouldn't be able to understand any of all the kind of heuristics and all the kind of stories that exist around that, whereas an adult might. So first of all, you've got to understand the kind of their context, and how they view the world. The second thing is around just their cognitive abilities. So we will often talk about, when we're crafting stories for children, you kind of want maybe only 1 or 2 points of cognitive dissonance. So, if you take a classic IP like Peppa Pig, that world is really relatable for children. It's going to nursery school, it's home, it's in the car, everything that they do. But the one thing of cognitive dissonance which makes it a little bit exciting is the fact they're all animals and it's pigs driving cars. So with children, we at one point we even kind of plotted the number of cognitive dissonance points you can include in a story before a child goes, I have no idea what's going on now. If you look at something like an Adventure Time, where there's just lots of weird things in the world, young children just they just turn off because they look at it and they go, this is just too weird. So adults can have lots more kind of analogies and similes and kind of metaphors and all this kind of stuff that they can then, you can throw in much more points of cognitive dissonance that they can handle and they get excited by, because cognitive dissonance is quite exciting to kind of go, oh, that's not quite what would happen normally, but children can't mentally and emotionally kind of manage all those different moments. So when crafting children stories for children, you kind of need to think about that. But the other thing is that you need to kind of, particularly when you go young children, their concept of reality and story is so intertwined and blurred. So, you talk to a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old and unicorns do exist.
Yeah.
And dragons do exist. And, that they could probably imagine a world where they can fly. So actually that kind of, their reality and stories are so kind of weirdly intertwined. Again, that's something that's quite exciting when you're talking with children. So yeah, there is a difference. But then also when you talk about parents, one of the really interesting, exciting things and why I love what I do so much is that that children and adults are ultimately are often a single decision-making unit. So the child, so if, for example, you're talking about, you want to persuade families to go to a new family blockbuster, you've got the child and you need to have a conversation with the child about what's going on here so that they're excited about going. So when mum or dad says, we're going to go and see the new, whatever, Kung Fu Panda movie, that the kid goes, yay! But then you need to tell a very different story to the parent because they might not be excited by the same things the child is excited by. So it can get really complicated about creating these kind of multi-layered stories that you need to tell, where bits of it are really relevant to children, bits of it are really relevant to adults. You can be quite clever and tactical and as far as like, if you are in an environment where you're talking to children, so if, for example, you do a poster campaign around kids' play parks, then, that might be something where you tell the more story, you tell the more child story, and then if you're doing a Facebook post, then you tell the parent story. But there's often times where they're together, and in which case you've got to craft this narrative, which is about kind of hitting both of them. So because ultimately they'll make the decisions together as a kind of single unit. So I really enjoy that part about kind of family is that you're talking to. So and their needs and their requirements are so vastly different. It's not like you're talking, if you're selling a car to a husband and wife, then ultimately they've probably got very similar sets of needs. They might have a different set of values, but they've got a very similar set of needs. But when you're talking about a 4-year-old and a 28-year-old mom, their requirements of this thing is going to be vastly different. So crafting a story that works on both levels is fun.
That's so interesting. And while you were talking, I was thinking back to when my daughter was young. I mean, she's 20 now, but that the things that we like to watch or do together. So I'm thinking of some really good pantomimes that we went to over the years when there were loads of stuff that appealed to her, but then there were some quite rude jokes in them that the adults in the room thought were hilarious. The kids didn't understand, but were laughing because all the adults were laughing. And I think it's really clever when you've got those kind of multi-layered communications that hit the spot for different audiences and they can all collectively have a really great experience.
You look at some of and as you mentioned, your daughter's probably a little bit old for this now, but Bluey is absolutely going bonkers at the moment, and it's because it works on multiple levels. And this is something that we've known for years. You look at The Simpsons works on about 12 different levels. But something like Bluey. And interestingly, I worked on Bluey before it was even released, like very, very first kind of concept stuff that they sent through to me. And I was like, oh, it feels a bit too parent focused. I don't think the kids will get it. Because they talk about some of the stories are really sophisticated and, talking about some really deep stuff. One of them's all about a kind of mum's guilt about the amount of time that she spends with her children and the fact that as they're growing up, that they might not, that she's missing opportunities to engage with them. And you think, wowzers, that's, and kids just won't get that. They won't understand that. But it works because the parents absolutely love that story element to it. It really, really works with them. There's many, many stories of, parents kind of breaking down in tears watching Bluey because it's just so well done. But then the kids love the fact that there's, Bandit and Bluey, who are the two kind of characters that are just fun and mucking about. And I think the fact that the stories work on both levels really makes that work because parents proactively go, let's watch Bluey, rather than, let's watch this other show that I don't really like, but I'll sit and kind of endure. But they actually go, let's watch this together because it's a brilliant joint storytelling opportunity that just works for them.
I feel like I need to start watching it. Yeah, I definitely miss Bluey. But I do think I probably would be the one of the parents crying if I was watching that episode.
I wasn't crying. I had something in my eye.
Dust.
I had something in my eye.
The one that we used to watch together all the time was Horrible Histories, because that for me was, I loved watching it, and I would say, oh, should we watch some Horrible Histories? And I can remember when it finished, we were both crying. Me and my daughter were like absolutely inconsolable, because it was the end of that run, and it was something that we both enjoyed. And I think it sounds similar to people's experiences with maybe some of these newer programs, where you're not having to be like, oh, fine, I'll sit and watch it. It's a real pleasure to watch those sorts of things.
Absolutely.
I wanted to come back to something you said earlier about cognitive dissonance, because I think that's such an important point. So in the world where I work, in the kind of corporate storytelling space, this is something that people really struggle with, because if you're a leader and you're trying to give a message about a change or a new strategy, the temptation to be super positive about everything and not to touch in those areas that might be difficult is enormous. But I say it constantly to people I work with, that's the bit that engages people. So that kind of surprise, difference, a little bit of stress in the story, it's not a bad thing. And I think it's really interesting when you made the point that that's the part that people find interesting. So if you're just telling a story as a strategy or as a corporate, or actually in marketing, I guess, although I'd be interested in your view on this, there has to be that emotion. It can't just be, this is all amazing and everything's going to be brilliant. People don't get excited about that. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I think the points of cognitive dissonance are the bits of the story which allow your imagination to embrace the story. Because, I think if it's a very straightforward story without any moments of kind of jeopardy or intrigue or conflict, or it's all kind of flowing quite normally, you're not going to remember it as much as a story that where you all of a sudden go, oh, that's interesting. It just fires different parts of the brain, and all of a sudden your kind of head's going, what's going on here? It just makes you sit up. One of the things that we do a lot with is we will get children to watch content that our clients have made, and kind of watch them watching the content. And ultimately, and it can be really hard for 3 and 4-year-olds to kind of get some good constructive criticism of a piece of creative content. But what we will always do is kind of say, tell me what happened, because that will then tell us what bit stuck and what bit didn't stick, and what bit they remember and what bit they don't remember. And they will be the moments of kind of affinity and attachment with the story. And it's either often a moment of kind of peril, or it's a moment of cognitive dissonance where they just go, oh, I didn't expect that. I didn't expect all of a sudden them to open the drawer and a dog would jump out, because I wasn't expecting that. So it's those moments that they remember, and ultimately probably make the story a bit more sticky in their mind, and definitely a bit more exciting and interesting. I mean, it's slightly different with brands, and there's definitely a move now for authenticity in storytelling. And authenticity in storytelling, if you think about the world, even like 15 years ago, brands would never talk about anything that's wrong. They would, it's all brilliant, amazing, beautiful, nothing to see here. Whereas now, I think, again, and this is partly due to the rise of social media and how so many influencers on social media kind of bare their authentic souls and kind of it's warts and all, that brands are beginning to realize that actually that's the sort of stories that are resonating with this audience now, that it's not warts and all, but it's definitely show the odd wart. And some do it well, and some embrace it, and some are still just petrified. They're still kind of like, I can't do that. It's too much. It's too, we've carefully crafted this brand over the last 60 years as being the absolute pinnacle of perfection. And now all of a sudden we need to kind of draw the curtain back a little bit and kind of go, well, we don't do everything right, so. And I think the brands that are much more willing to embrace kind of a genuine, authentic conversation with an audience who are sophisticated, they know that brands aren't perfect, they're not stupid, that actually will be the ones that ultimately win through. Particularly when you look on, the more authentic platforms like TikTok, so TikTok, the stories there are always, are a lot less crafted than Instagram even, or even than Facebook, and so And I think that's due to the younger generation just being much more willing to embrace the fact that they have flaws, which is the whole kind of mental health thing. And that's kind of, they're just much more open to talking about the fact that everything isn't hunky-dory and amazing and perfect, and that it's not all unicorns and rainbows. There are some problems. And so I think brands that are kind of embracing authenticity, and authenticity meaning we have problems, I think will be ultimately the ones that win through.
I agree, but I do appreciate the struggle. I get pushed back quite a lot with leaders. So we don't want to talk about that side of the change program because it's all a bit negative. Well, you're going to have to, because everyone else knows it's going to happen, and if you don't, it will come back to bite you. It's the classic. A leader does a big announcement about a new strategy or a big change, and someone asks the question, are there going to be any redundancies? And they go, no. And then, 6 months down the line, there are, and then immediately you look like a liar. So let's just deal with it head on. Let's it's not about scaring people. It's just about being authentic, as you say. But it's something I think that leaders really struggle with.
And it's terrifying. We see it in so many different places. So the kind of the lack of transparency, I guess, is something that I think people are just getting more and more sick of. It feels that they're just, that they're much more happy to call out lack of transparency. And me and my business, I'm very transparent with our revenues, and I share that on a monthly basis with everybody in the team. And so it's great when it's great because everyone's like, woohoo, it's great. And then, but it's a little bit of a wake up call when it's not great, and they can kind of look at it and go, oh, that's not brilliant. But I just think it's so important to treat people like adults and go, you know what, they're not, these people are doing the work every single day. So they know if they're busy or if they're quiet. They're not going to be going, oh, it's great, I don't have any client work this week. They're going to go, oh, actually, that's probably some consequences to the fact that I don't have any client work this week. So I think the kind of honesty and transparency, and it's interesting because we see it with clients, and I guess you probably do the same, which is where they'll kind of send you a brief and you go, brilliant, could you share the budget? And they'll go, no, we don't have a budget. And you go, I know you have a budget. You just don't want to tell me. And that's fine. And I understand the reason why. And I think the reason why is they think that, if the second I find out it's a 50 grand budget, I'll go, great, I'll come up with a 40 grand plan and just stick 10 grand on top because I know they've got the money. But you think that's just, that's not the way it works. That's not the reality of the situation. I'll give you the best deal possible. But the worst thing is when there's no transparency and you go, I don't know what I'm doing. This isn't helpful to me. So yeah, I think transparency is essential. And I think, as I say, we're seeing it more and more in kind of brand storytelling, at least.
That's good to hear, actually, because I think I'm definitely, in my work, people are getting more comfortable with it. I think it still scares them. The idea certainly for leaders of showing vulnerability and allowing a strategy to kind of be looked at critically by the audience is a bit challenging for people. I spend a lot of my time talking about resistance to change as well, and how we shouldn't be afraid of what we perceive as resistance. Maybe it's just people having some questions, and that's a good thing, right? So I think it's shifting slowly, but there's lots of stuff behind it. I think there's kind of leader as hero and all that sort of thing. Leaders are sometimes a bit afraid of not having the answers, and I think that can sometimes drive certain behaviours.
I think also one of the challenges with strategy is that I don't think I've ever come up with a strategy that isn't about compromise and that isn't about, there has been some tough decisions that have had to be made. And there's a kind of famous analogy, a famous story about how there was this one hunting tribe in kind of like in America, and they were a very successful hunting tribe. And the way that they worked out where to hunt was they took like an animal hip bone, threw it in the fire, whichever way it cracked was the direction that they went in. And the point is that they were very, very successful because they had a very clearly defined strategy of, no, hip bone tells us this way, this is the way we're going. And sometimes there is a an advantage in a slightly kind of dogmatic approach to strategy of saying, no, this is what we've decided and this is the way we're going to go. Because what the tribes that didn't do well is they'd start off this way and then someone will go, actually, I think we need to go, it's like a pub crawl. Actually, I think we need to go over here. And then you kind of go over there and that's closer. Oh, actually, let's go. If you kind of fix a strategy in place and kind of stick to it slightly dogmatically, then that can sometimes, there's obviously perils to that you want to be able to know when to quit, but that can sometimes be more effective. But the challenges with that is that it doesn't always hold up to deep scrutiny. And, in some ways you want to stop everybody going, yeah, but that strategy is okay, but have you thought about this? And so sometimes, I get it, because sometimes you go, look, it's not the perfect strategy, but it's a strategy, we've got to deal with it. That's almost the conversation you want to have, but you don't want to appear that you are dogmatic. You want to appear that you are open and flexible, but at the same time, you don't want to have to relive the entire nuanced compromises that you've made to get to the place you're at. Because, again, some of them, you go, these are just decisions I had to make, and you might not have made that decision, but sadly, I'm the one that has to make them, and this is the one that I've gone with. And you don't necessarily want to open up your decision making to kind of deep scrutiny of people going, well, that's rubbish, because it's almost certainly something that you toiled over and thought about for a long old time, and you just you almost go, look, it's the decision's been made, let's all just crack on with it type thing. So I do understand the need to kind of not necessarily open strategies up for deep discussion, because it can sometimes just be not effective.
But I think you've hit the nail on the head there, because I think the issue often is not that people don't want to go along with the strategy, but they don't understand how it's come to be. And I think I see it all the time on change programs I work on. We are immersed in the program for months and months, probably before anyone else even knows about it. So we know everything about it. And then suddenly one day the time comes to communicate it out to the organisation, and we present this thing to them. And they haven't had the months and months of getting their head around it. They've just got today when we're going, ta-da! And then they go, oh, I'm not sure about that. And then our reaction is, well, why are you asking me so many questions? And we get all defensive. And actually, it's sometimes just because people don't get how you got to where you got to. And if we put a bit more effort into not saying, look, challenge this, but actually to say, we've done this because of this, this and this before you were involved, and this is why. I think that's what people need sometimes, rather than the opportunity to pick it apart. But we can get a bit defensive, I think, of our work.
Absolutely. We all get defensive about, particularly when you've had to make a very big decision that you that you've used all your cognitive skills and powers of reasoning to kind of come to, and then, you kind of, someone within 10 minutes goes, well, that's a terrible decision. You go, you have no idea how I worked to try and make that decision. But, and it varies by organization. I'm lucky, to a degree, that there's only 7 of us. So actually, it's so easy for me to kind of get everybody's input into some of my big decisions, and everybody understands that I can't take everybody's input as being what's going to happen. But it's very easy for me to kind of make sure that everybody's involved in the big decisions. But when you're running an organization of 10,000 people, it's impossible. There will always be somebody who goes, this isn't the right decision. And I guess that's about the challenges of and making sure you've got a slightly thick skin in leadership, and also, again, making sure you've got a compelling story and reason for why you're doing it, and being honest about some of the compromises that you've had to make along the way and what that looks like for people. And look, there'll always be people who go, well, that's a stupid decision.
Fine.
And that's just life. There's always people that are going to think that you're wrong. But hopefully, I guess, as a leader, part of my job is to make sure I go, well, did I consider everything that I could possibly have considered? And did I actually weigh up all the options? And if I'm confident in myself that I did, then I can stand behind it and go, well, I'm sorry, you don't like it. That's, I did consider everything, I promise.
And I think as a leader, that's quite a freeing, if you can get to that point, that's quite freeing. You want to take people with you, but sometimes you can't, and that's okay. And I think as when working through change, that's a lot of the conversations I have. Sometimes people won't like it, and that's all right. They have a choice. They can do something else. They can go and work somewhere else, or they can put up with it and just, put their head down and carry on. That's fine. We'll accept that. I wanted to touch on the other bit of your work. So we talked about strategy, we talked about brand marketing, but research, because I think storytelling in research I find fascinating, because it's obviously something that I've had to do in my own research, is to create a story. And when I was writing my PhD thesis, because it was about storytelling, I felt really strongly that I wanted to tell a story in the thesis. And I got real pushback from my academic tutors about it. They were like, it's not academic enough, Susanne. And I was like, well, it just doesn't feel authentic to me to write something about story that isn't a story. It feels weird. So I did it thinking, oh God, I hope this worked. And thankfully it did. But I think it's really hard to tell compelling stories about research. I don't know your experience of it.
It is. And I think that the kind of the clash comes, and I get the clash. The clash comes with the feeling that what stories do is potentially obfuscate facts, and twist narratives to tell a certain story, which don't necessarily fully engage all the nuance of it. As somebody in research, there's never, particularly when you're doing like numbers and quantity stuff, or even both, there's never you don't come away and go, great, everybody thought exactly the same thing, and I've got an incredibly beautiful narrative. There will always be points where you kind of go, oh, that data doesn't gel with the story I'm trying to tell here. So much of our job is not is about translating the complexities of the world into something that's simple to understand. It's not about simplifying the complexities of the world, because that then ignores the fact that it is a very, very complex world. But what we are trying to do is make the complexity useful. And sometimes I've fallen into the trap of being slightly academic with some of the research that we offer, where you kind of go, well, this is what the research told us. 20% of people thought this, 20% of people have thought that, 20% said this, 20% said that. And they look at you and go, well, that's not useful. Pick one, again, it's down to that kind of pick a strategy and let's run with it, and so sometimes you need to just take a step back and go, okay, well, what is going to be the most compelling story which I can craft a strategy around, which I think is the strategy that is the optimal strategy. So, that's where, and storytelling comes in like multiple different places within research. But when we talk about the kind of end delivery of the kind of conveying the research back to the client, you have to craft a narrative through the data points. And you have to make sure that you're very comfortable that the narrative tells as much of the whole truth as you can possibly tell. You don't want to leave out anything which is like 90% of people actually totally disagree with this narrative. But, you want to make sure that you are, again, part of our job is to kind of pick the best and leave the rest type stuff and kind of go, well, actually, this is what we think. So, our job, again, is translators a lot of the time of the data, because data itself doesn't tell a story. Data is just a random collection of points. And again, our job is to kind of go, okay, what is the narrative that we can craft through as many of these points as possible that is something that's useful for a client? The last thing I want to do is create something that's interesting and not useful, because, the clients go, great, really interesting, but you've not changed my business. I can't do anything with this. So, that's where, that's kind of where story is. And that's at the end. But story is kind of through the whole of research. So, when we talk about, even at the beginning, when we're doing things like creating discussion guides, actually it's really important that a discussion guide in a one-on-one interview or a focus group has a narrative to it. You don't want to be jumping all over the place and kind of going, we're now going to talk about this, we're now going to talk about... You want it to try and flow, because that's when people understand where we're going and can kind of come along the ride of this story. So much, often the client will go, here are 20 questions. And it takes a long time to go, okay, how how do we make this flow in the most natural way? But also what you want to do is make sure that, at the beginning, you're not kind of biasing any decisions and kind of opinions later on. So it's a real delicate journey to try and create that story. And particularly when you're talking to younger children, because you want them to kind of follow along with what's going along. And the second the story kind of what they're telling you jumps off a rails and goes somewhere else, they go, and all of a sudden you've lost them. So that kind of storytelling process in actually how you ask the questions is just as important as how you then reveal the strategy at the end of it as well.
That's so interesting. I mean, it really, I'm thinking back to my own research over the years, and that idea of crafting that structure that you use around an interview or a focus group is so important. And I'm reminded of Magruder Watkins, I think it was, who talks about appreciative inquiry, that you plan tight but hang loose. So you create this plan of what you want to happen, but you also recognize in the moment you might need to adapt it, so that someone will say something and you're like, oh, that's interesting, I'm going to go down that little rabbit hole, but then you know where you want to end up. And I think in any form of interaction, whether that's research or simply just running some training or something like that, you have to have that structure so you know where you're getting to.
Disciplined curiosity.
Oh, I like that.
You've got to be, as a moderator, and I can sometimes be undisciplinedly curious, particularly when I'm talking to teens, because they're just fascinating, and I just love talking to them. And someone will say something, you're like, whoa, wow, what is that about? And all of a sudden you realize, okay, this isn't what the client wanted to find out. This is just my own personal, my natural researcher kind of kicks in and goes, ooh. But so yes, there is a disciplined curiosity of like, okay, is it relevant to go down this? Ultimately you got to think on the fly a little bit and kind of go, okay, does this rabbit hole help answer some of the client's bigger questions, or is this just a kind of a folly, which is a moderator folly, or actually is there value in that?
Yeah, I'm just very nosy, so I've always found it very difficult when I've been doing research to stick to the script, because sometimes I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Let's go and explore that.
I've had many clients, well, not many, but quite a few pull me up on kind of going, you didn't really stick to the script. Disciplined curiosity.
I like that. I'll use that. The next time a client asks me for an agenda for a meeting or a training session, and then I go off piece and they're like, well, that wasn't what we expected. And I'll say, but we ended up where we wanted to be.
Yes, exactly.
But I was just displaying my disciplined curiosity.
I mean, even this conversation itself, you've crafted the story, the narrative that you want to tell, and that's so important. Ultimately, research is about uncovering people's truths, and often the easiest way to uncover people's truths is to get them to tell a story. Yeah. Again, part of our role as moderators is to know when the story is real, and how much, everybody's got a certain amount of kind of memory bias, and they kind of go, yeah, this story is definitely right. But, and so that's part of the challenge of, which is the difference between quant and qual research ultimately. With quant, it's just tell me yes or no. But whereas with qual, that's where that's where the story comes from. And that's where, data will tell us why, or data will tell us what, but the qual will tell us the reasons behind all of that. And so, ultimately, so much of it is about crafting opportunities for the research participants to tell us a story. Because that's going to be where we get the most exciting interest from. And again, that can be very challenging with a 4-year-old, because they all of a sudden go, yes, and then I went down a mine and met a magical goblin. You go, okay, okay, I'm not sure we're back on reality here. So, but yeah, that's an exciting part of research. Yeah, it's kind of uncovering people's stories.
I would love to sit in on some of your focus groups. They sound really fun.
They're amazing. Honestly, it's the best job in the world.
I don't, I do similar things. So a big part of mine is just getting people talking and telling me stuff, and it's fantastic. It's just the best thing ever, and you uncover so many things about how an organisation works just by listening to what people are talking about. It's amazing. I don't know why everyone doesn't do it.
Yeah, but the challenge is, and this is an inherent universal challenge with the research, is the difference between stated and actual behavior.
Yeah.
So and people love telling you stories about the best parts of them, but they don't necessarily love stories about the worst parts of them, and they love to present themselves in a certain way. So again, it's that really delicate balance between getting them to tell a story, but then at some point stopping the story and going, really, and kind of particularly with, I guess with everybody, but we see it a lot with teens where they kind of have a perception, there's some 50-year-old bloke in front of them asking them questions and they go, okay, I think these are the answers that this dude wants to hear. And actually so much is about how do we get around that, and how do we kind of manage that and kind of stop them telling the story that they think we want to hear and get them to start telling the story that's the truth. And that can be very hard. With kids, it's easy because they just tell you in the truth. They're not trying to obfuscate anything. They're not trying to position or present themselves in a certain way. They're just kind of telling you their truth. The challenge is to sometimes work out with kids whether or not their truth is the truth, but with teens it can be very different. And with parents it's even more difficult because they're riddled with so much guilt about how they raise their children. Or the classic one is we often ask parents about screen time. And how much screen time their children have, and they can be sat next to the child and, and the parents going, yeah, we have a very strict rule on 30 minutes a day. And the child's looking at them going, well,
no, we don't.
We do, but that's never actually happened. I just kind of come along and go, can I have a bit more, please? And the parents go, yeah, absolutely. Or even co-viewing, when we say, do you sit down and watch stuff with each other? They go, all the time. It's such a great bonding moment. And again, the kids are going, no, you don't.
Are you always on your phone when we're
Well, you put YouTube on in the living room and you go and do your chores. That's that's the reality of the situation. So that's part of the fun of being a researcher.
So interesting. I mean, there's a whole other podcast there, isn't there, about how at what point do we switch from telling stories because we're children and we love telling them to telling stories that we think people want to hear. That could be a whole other conversation.
Yeah, and we're experimenting, arguably controversially, but we're experimenting with AI in using chatbots as a means of, now they're so sophisticated, you can basically craft a chatbot, and we've created a couple that do a really good job of disciplined curiosity and kind of going, this is the objective, but if they start going down this path, ask them a few questions. If he goes off track, bring it back. Now, the interesting thing about that is that but we would state very much early on, I am an AI. And what we are finding, it's not perfect, but it's still in the early stages, but what we're finding is that people are more honest with it because they know it's not a human. So they know that this AI isn't judging them. They know that this AI isn't forming a kind of a preconception about them and their lives. So actually, there's a sense of honesty that's coming from it. That you will often get more honesty in a quant than a qual because they go, it's just a survey. I'll just tell the truth. There's no repercussions. I don't have someone judging me, staring at me while it's happening. Whereas with an AI, I think there's something interesting there as far as they're much more willing to be open because they don't feel they're being judged by another human.
Gosh, that is fascinating. That is a whole other podcast. You'll have to come back on and talk about that another time.
Podcast. Yeah.
We're running out of time, so which I can't believe, but it's been so fascinating. I've really enjoyed talking to you. If people want to find out more about you and your work, where should they go?
So we are family, so we-are-family.com. Or just look me up on LinkedIn. I post loads, so you can kind of see what we're doing on there. Look me up on LinkedIn or go to the website, check out what we do.
Amazing. It's been such a joy talking to you. Thank you for coming on and chatting to me.
We should do this more in real life.
We really should. Let's do it face to face next time. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Change Stories podcast. I love this conversation and I hope you did too. Thanks as ever to my wonderful guests and to Pete Morgan at Monkey Pants Productions for making the podcast sound amazing. If you want to find out more about this or any other episodes of Change Stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk where you will find all the episodes and show notes. If you have enjoyed listening, Please rate and review the Change Stories podcast on your podcast listening platform. And do please let me know if you have ideas or requests for future episodes. You can contact me and find out more about change and storytelling on my website, www.feldsparconsulting.com. Thanks again for joining in with the Change Stories conversation.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.